From the start of April to mid-June each year, it is almost inevitable that the collective memory here in the Falkland Islands turns to anniversaries of the invasion of 1982. But you don't need to look far to see that there is more than just military history to these islands. The late 19th century saw something of a heyday for the maritime industry here in Stanley, but it was events thousands of miles away in the United States of America that were to provide the drive behind this business. An ever-increasing number of ships were needed to fuel the rapid expansion, loading on the eastern coast, often in New York. Sailing ships of all shapes and sizes made the perilous journey around Cape Horn to and from the eastern coast, carrying everything needed for the settlement of the western states. It was these enterprising vessels and nature herself that would so often deliver opportunity to Port Stanley.
The John R Kelley was built in Maine, and at 256 feet long, she was described at the time as the second largest ship ever built in America. She remains one of the largest wooden vessels ever built. Proudly named after her owner, she was given the highest rating of any American ship, and thousands turned out to see her launch in 1883. But it was 6 years later, on a routine trip from New York to San Francisco, that the Kelley ran into Cape Horn's notorious gales and suffered worrying damage.
2 long days were spent making no progress, and eventually the decision was made to make for Stanley. It would take them 4 more days to reach harbour. The diary of Lydia Keane, a young passenger on board, tells us that boats were smashed apart, cargo lost, and she was covered in bruises from being thrown about the cabin.
The passengers would have known the risks of Cape Horn. They talk about other wrecks, both there and here in the Falklands. The threat of death must have weighed heavily on their minds. We read that the captain knew that his ship was broken and had already decided that they would never make port. In some effort to reassure the ladies on board, he explained that should she founder, he would lock these companionway doors to prevent their bodies from feeding the fish. It can't have been very reassuring in the circumstances.
Later accounts suggested that her cargo had been too heavy, and this had compounded the problems that she faced. Certainly, the list of her cargo seems long even by today's standards. Tens of thousands of iron fittings, dozens of boilers, kegs of nuts, bolts and nails, sacks of food, crates of ink, pickaxes, chair seats, sheep dip, the list goes on and on. Everything anyone needed to build a new life in the Wild West.
Whatever the true cause, the captain's job was to make for safety, and the sense of relief as they entered Port William is tangible in the records. They knew they weren't safe yet. After all, the city of Philadelphia had gone down in those very waters not long before with no survivors, but surely their chances were increasing.
Captain Chapman braved the boat ashore with his wife and daughters, but was unable to return to his ship as yet another gale rose. It didn't take long for the Kelley to drag her anchors, and the crew could only stand by helplessly as she forced herself onto the rocks in Port William that bear her name to this day. The crew were fully aware of what had happened to the city of Philadelphia and raised the alarm, signalling the lighthouse at Cape Pembroke and desperately hoping that some help could be sent.
They were lucky. Their signal was seen, and a young boy, Charles Coulson, was sent to ride the 7-mile track to Stanley. His must have been a cold and lonely journey, riding as fast as he dared but constantly hampered by the pitch dark and the cold and rain of the storm.
Sadly for Captain Chapman, by now aware of the danger his crew were in, not a boat could be found that could or would dare go to their aid, so he could do nothing but watch and hope. It was clear that the cargo was lost, but that was ensured. The crew were a different concern altogether. They were to spend an unenviable night housed on deck, constantly being drenched and listening to the groaning and splitting of wood beneath their feet.
Fortunately for them all, the next day the storm blew out, and the crew were able to be rescued by a local steam launch with a volunteer crew. What had become clear, however, was that the John R Kelley and its cargo was a total wreck, just like the Charles Cooper here on the outskirts of Stanley. Now, that's a loss today of over $4 million. The insurance would cover the cargo, but the John R Kelley herself wasn't insured. That might sound expensive, but she'd already paid for herself twice over by that point, so we don't need to pity John Kelley too much. With the ship wrecked, the whole cargo ruined, and all the personal possessions of the passengers and the crew now taking an extended salt bath, it was time to look to the future. Fortune is an unpredictable mistress, however, and Captain Chapman soon secured passage for himself and his crew on board a familiar friend.
The Cyrus Wakefield had been loading alongside the John R Kelley back in New York and had also been forced to make for Stanley en route to San Francisco. Wakefield's captain had not been as fortunate as Chapman. He had been thrown across the deck in heavy seas and suffered a fatal fracture to his skull. Chapman was to benefit from his sad demise. There they were, a shipless captain and a captainless ship, both unexpectedly in Stanley and both trying to get to San Francisco. People of the Falklands, the John R Kelley provided a surprise windfall that was never to be forgotten. Much of the cargo was soon salvaged by divers brought over from Chile. The old Globe Store's warehouse was literally sagging under the weight of the goods they now possessed, and evidence from the wreck can be found across town today. 120 years later, pieces of the John R Kelley's cargo can still be bought here in Stanley. These Stafford ink bottles, on sale in the museum shop, are a rare opportunity to own some genuine 19th century shipwrecked cargo. The legacy of the John R Kelley still survives. And remember, the John R Kelley is just one story in the rich maritime history of these islands. If you want to discover more and see some of the artefacts from the ships themselves, make your way here to the Historic Dockyard Museum. And there's an appeal from the Museum and National Trust. Both the ship's wheel and a medal awarded to the boy Charles Coulson have been missing from the museum's collection since shortly after the 1982 war. The distinctive ship's wheel, inlaid with metal stars and eagles, was last photographed at the Kelley's doors here in 1979 and hasn't been seen since. The medal, we are told, was inscribed to Coulson, so should be easily identified. If you have any idea where either of these important artefacts might be or are able to return them to the museum's collection, please contact the Historic Dockyard Museum on 27428, or you can email researcher@falklands-museum.co.fk.